Why does one video look like a Hollywood film and another looks like it was shot on an iPhone 1.5 and they're using the same camera? Let's talk about frame rates. Before we get into frame rates, what is a frame? So a frame is one still image that your camera captures. So a frame and an image, you can use them interchangeably, but a frame is a picture or an image your camera captures. So what's a frame rate? The frame rate is how many of those images your camera captures in 1 second. For example, 24 frames per second means that your camera is capturing 24 still images in a second. If you have 30 frames per second, that means that your camera is capturing 30 still images or 30 pictures one after the other in a second. I hope you're tracking and I hope you're following that. So that's a frame rate. And I want you to think about it like this. When I was younger, they used to have what you call a flip book, and we would draw stick figures inside of the flip book. We would draw stick figures on multiple pages, and then we would open it up and we would flip the pages. And as you flip the pages, it appeared as if the stick figure was moving, and that's called motion. So I want you to think about that for a second. I said that your camera captures an image or a frame, and frame rate is just 24 still images or 30 still images in a second. Then that means that the images are not moving. So why does it look like motion? Think about it. What does Hollywood call it? Hollywood calls it a motion picture. So let me help you. Your brains fill in the blank. It's called persistence of vision. So your eyes at 24 frames per second and above, your eyes looks at motion and your brain fills in the blank. So everything appears as if it's motion. Here's the common frame rates that you're gonna use and that you need to be concerned about in this basic course. There's a few others, but trust me, you only need these three right here for now. And once you get these three down pat, you can venture out to others for whatever creative idea you want to use. But in Hollywood and on television, these are the frame rates that they use to create content. So the first frame rate is 24 frames per second. Or if you have a film camera, some type of film camera, it's 23.98 frames per second. And those both give you the same type of look. And that is a cinematic look, a narrative or a cinematic look. So if you want that cinematic goodness in your images, you're going to use 24 frames per second or 23.98 frames per second. Now, the next frame rate that you're going to use, or that is one of the most common frame rates, is 30 frames per second or 29.97 frames per second. So if your camera had, you can use either one. Some cameras don't have the latter, the 29.97 or the 23.98. Some cameras don't have it, but you'll have 24 and you'll have 30. And 30 frames per second is the same frame rate they use in broadcast and television. So when you watch TV shows, the news, they're using 30 frames per second. Now, some TV shows also shoot in 24 frames per second, but primarily broadcast, they shoot in 30 frames per second. Or when you see people streaming content, it's normally done in 30 frames per second or 29.97 frames per second. The last frame rate I want you to know is 60 frames per second or 59.94. Again, you can use either or depending on what your camera has. If your camera has both, you can pick and choose which one you want to use. But 60 frames per second or 59.94 frames per second is the frame rate they use to shoot sports. So if you notice, television and film has a different look to it. And regular TV from sports has a different look. And that's because of the frame rate. 60 frames per second or 59.94 frames per second is also used to do slow motion. So if you like the way that buttery smooth slow motion looks, you have to use at least 60 frames per second or 59.94 frames per second. Let's check your knowledge. So why does one film or one content creator create content that looks like a Hollywood film and someone else uses the same camera and it just does not look good or it does not look the same? And it's partially because of the frame rate. And you have to use the frame rate properly. Here's the next challenge that I want you to do. Take an action, whether you're pouring water or some kind of liquid, or you're clapping, or you're moving your hands in front of the camera, or you're running, and I want you to film it in all of the frame rates I told you about. 24 frames per second or 23.98 frames per second. Then film it in 30 or 29.97 frames per second, and then film it in 60 frames per second or 59.94 frames per second. And I want you to compare it so you can start looking and seeing what frame rates things are shot in. And the more you do this, you'll be able to tell off the bat, hey, this was shot in 24, this was shot in 30, this was shot in 60. Go out and I want you to create something awesome and use this time to play around with the settings and to start recognizing what frame rates are being used and what are the differences in how they look. So I'll see you in the next class. Again, go create something amazing.